Hello, Alan. I'm just explaining to the audience that, to my mind, I think that this is a big test right now of who really influences who, in the sense of either Netanyahu listens to Trump and he doesn't do anything. We don't see an Israeli operation or response, and therefore America has more influence over Israel, or Bibi's like, and he does so anyway. And therefore that demonstrates that in specific times of crisis like now, the Israelis will do whatever they want, regardless of what the US administration demands. Obviously, there's a lot more to it than that. I'm sure you have more thoughts, but yeah, welcome to the show. Firstly, what do you think about the situation?
Yeah, I think the former, first of all, thank you for having me again. I think the former is far more likely than the latter. I think if President Trump says, stand down, Bibi, Bibi's going to stand down, despite the adverse domestic political fallout that will ensue from Israel not retaliating against Iran. I think, yeah, go ahead.
No, but do you not think that because the whole argument has been that this war came about because of Netanyahu's manipulation of Trump in the first place. So does this not demonstrate that ultimately Trump holds the power, even if he didn't want to go to war?
I mean, there was a confluence of, or a perceived confluence of strategic interest between Israel and the United States. Prime Minister Netanyahu made the case to, President Trump. President Trump said, okay, let's do it. That wasn't, Bibi didn't tell Trump to attack Iran, but Trump is going to tell Bibi not to attack Iran. So there's a manifest disproportion or imbalance between power between the U.S. and Iran. I mean, the U.S. and Israel, right? The U.S. has the whip hand in the relationship. It doesn't mean that Israel is not going to try by other means to restart wide-scale military actions against Iran, for example, attacking Beirut again, in the hopes that Iran will escalate. Because let's be clear, Israel wants Iran to retaliate so that it can say, we're just defending ourselves.
Yeah, I mean, I've always been on the fence about just how much influence the Israelis have over America. I mean, I'm not going to go down the rabbit hole of sort of AIPAC or whatever the conspiracy theorists are. Obviously, there's a lot of Israeli influence because of legacy and control of companies or whatever. But like to sort of say that the US is entirely run by some sort of deep state of Israeli-minded individuals is obviously a bit extreme to me. But like just for the audience's sort of to bring us up to speed, Alan, like what is the situation? So the IDS said that the IRGC had shot a bunch of missiles towards different parts of the country in response to Israel's operations in Lebanon. Is that largely the gist of it?
Well, first, just to address your issue of Israel influencing the United States, I mean, sort of a straw man. No, Israel does not run the United States, obviously. But yes, it has a disproportionate influence in American political decision-making. There is written into U.S. law, QMA, that Israel must have qualitative military advantage over any and all possible military opponents in the Middle East. That's U.S. legislation. You've got the House majority and minority leaders. You've got senators and Congress people all saying nothing is more important than the strategic defense of Israel. You've got a clause in this year's NDAA, National Defense Authorization Act, that tries to merge, to an extent, Israeli and U.S. defense cooperation or defense purchases or whatever. So Israel has a massive influence on U.S. International relations. And, again, that's not conspiracy theory. That's a demonstrated fact. In terms of what's going on now, yeah, Israel wants to restart the war. It also wants to maintain pressure against Hezbollah. So it is, despite its assurances that it wouldn't, Beirut, the Dahia region, contrary to what they'd agreed to in the ceasefire. So Iran, which again sees the U.S. and Israel still as united in seeking to put more and more pressure on Iran and Hezbollah, responds disproportionately, okay? Because they want to establish escalation dominance. They're not scared of a restart of military hostilities, right? They've taken our best shot. So they need to reestablish escalation dominance or at least strategic deterrence. So yes, they respond against Israel. And President Trump now tells Israel to stand down because President Trump wisely needs to preserve some semblance of the ceasefire to allow time and breathing space for an agreement, a phase one agreement. So that's where
So,
we are.
no, I mean, of course, it makes sense, but like from your experience of dealing with this whole region, when you look at the situation of Israel's operations in Lebanon, I think we haven't spoken for a little bit since they really got into a new phase.
Mhm.
Like, is it going well? Because it doesn't strike me as though they're really achieving their preferred objectives right now, which is
No,
obviously
they're miring themselves in the same quagmire they did before. Much like the U.S. and Iran, I think it unlikely Israel can achieve strategically what it needs to in southern Lebanon militarily. But again, they see Hezbollah as part of a larger existential threat headed by Iran, and they want to solve that militarily. So they need to, in their eyes, continue the fight against Hezbollah. The war against Iran is popular in Israel. The war against Hezbollah is popular in Israel. Netanyahu is running for re-election, or will be, later this year. And it was politically toxic for him to not continue the war against Hezbollah in southern Lebanon. He wants to establish facts on the ground, even though perhaps he realizes intellectually that disarming Hezbollah is not possible. He's going to try.
So right now, we saw in the past 20 minutes that Trump said he's going to call Bibi. He's going to tell him not to respond. He said this to Axios and Channel 12, I think. Yeah, Barak Ravid. I'm just looking on X here. Yeah, very close to striking a deal with Iran to permanently end this war. I think we've been very close to a deal about 6 weeks from now. I think it's almost like a weekly anniversary at this point, Alan. Every Sunday night, he just says we're very close, and it's sort of like a routine, the same as going to have a sauna and a sort of massage on a Sunday or something. But do you think what do you think the conversation would be if Trump is ringing him up? Bibi must be absolutely seething and wanting to revenge, right? But Trump's not going to let him.
Yeah, I think, again, it'll be much like the last one that was reported, though I hope less profanity. President Trump will say, do not attack Iran. And President Netanyahu will say, I disagree. We still have this threat. They're not going away. You're not going to get a nuclear deal. We need to solve this militarily. President Trump will say, stand down. I'm close to a deal. Now, we are close to a deal, but a deal is like accelerating mass toward the speed of light. The closer you get, the harder it is. So we're close to a deal means we don't have a deal, which means the same intractable issues are still there. Now, we could probably get a phase one deal because all it is an MOU, a page or two, filled with platitudes and ambiguity that sets the stage for future negotiations that will never happen. So we could be close to a deal. I hope we're close to a deal. But that deal will essentially do, at best, two things. Extend the ceasefire and move toward opening the Strait of Hormuz in exchange for lifting the naval blockade on Iranian ports.
Well, we've had Ross on, or Ross Harrison. We've had Aaron David Miller yesterday. We've had plenty of experts and very, very insightful individuals. And one of the reoccurring themes, well, of course, you're amongst the top of the crop, Alan, but what the reoccurring theme is, apart from threshold or whatever, is horizontal and vertical escalation, up the escalation ladder, the escalation trap, all these buzzwords that I think sometimes get a little bit too carried away. In this context, what does this represent to you? Is this an escalation of some form, or it's just a flashpoint and it's not going to go anywhere because the Israelis won't respond? Or you think
in physics, again, I'll continue my physics similes. It's Brownian motion. It's all ceasefires are intrinsically unstable, especially when there's no corresponding viable political process ongoing. So you've got a ceasefire that's unstable, even more so than normally, because you don't just have two sides. If it were just Iran and the United States, this ceasefire would be more stable. But it's the United States, Iran, and Israel, and it's on two fronts. It's, Iran, the Persian Gulf, Strait of Hormuz, and there's obviously, conflagrations there. And then it's Lebanon, which Iran has successfully incorporated as part of the war against Iran, right? We lost that battle. So and then you take the fact that Israel wants to violate the ceasefire. Israel wants to continue military attacks. So you've got a three-body problem where one of the bodies doesn't like the ceasefire, wish it had never happened, and wants to continue military attacks. So this ceasefire is tremendously unstable. And even if there's a phase one agreement, it will continue to be very unstable, which is why I'm not optimistic about maritime traffic through the Strait of Hormuz increasing back to pre-war levels anytime soon, because maritime insurers are going to look and say, there's no phase two deal yet. There's a ceasefire. It's been extended, but all the stinky, hard to solve issues are still on the table and they haven't been solved. So for the moment, we're not going to return maritime insurance on cargo and on hull, to pre-war levels, right? Iran cannot reopen the Strait of Hormuz by itself. It can close it by itself, but 1,000 individual decisions of people who own vessels, who insure vessels, who serve on the crew in vessels, their collective decisions is what's going to be what either opens the strait or keep it constricted. And I think the latter is far more likely.
Well, you've had plenty of experience. I'm also in touch with another person who we were going to stream on. I don't know if you'd be game to have I don't know if you're familiar with her, Alia Brahimi. She's a non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council, but she might join us in 10 minutes, if that's all right with you. We could have a little...
I don't know her, but happy to...
Have a little brief discussion, and then I can let you go on your way and we can stay on. No, as you wish, but yeah, because I asked Alia if she would be down for it. She's in London. So yeah, she's going to join us in about 15 minutes, and then we can have a little back and forth maybe, and then you probably would have reached your saturation point and be like, okay, I want the rest of my day off now. But yeah, no, so just to on this point then, when it comes to negotiating deals and obviously all these frameworks, you are uniquely positioned with your experience on the JCPOA. So can you explain to me and the audience what an MOU really is? Because as far as I can understand, it's largely just a framework of agreement, right? We agree that we will work harder on some stuff, but that's about it. There's very little substance to it. It's just
an MOU is to an agreement what a first date is to marriage. Okay.
Oh, you didn't continue with the physics analogies there, Alex.
I was an English major, so I ran out of expertise on physics. So yeah, an MOU is two people in high school winking across a cafeteria. Okay. But it's a declaration of intention. That's all it is. Okay. So it's a good thing. It's a necessary but not sufficient condition for an agreement. When we were doing the JCPOA, before the JCPOA was the JPOA, right? A bunch of U.S. negotiators meeting clandestinely, and it's subsequently been revealed, so I'm not disclosing classified information, with the Iranians in Oman, came up with the framework of an interim agreement, fed that into the P5+1 multilateral nuclear negotiating process. Everyone said yes. So you had the JCPOA. You had a structure, an exoskeleton of an agreement that gave Iran some limited sanctions relief in exchange for continuing the process and in exchange for initial restrictions on their nuclear program. And that, as a confidence building measure and as a framework led to the JCPOA, a year or so later. So that's what this would do. Now, unfortunately, as far as I know, though I could be wrong, there hasn't been extensive bilateral, secret, one-to-one communications between the U.S. on Iran that to build a framework. They made a big story yesterday that Kushner and Witkoff went down to Tennessee to meet with nuclear experts. Why is that? That should have happened day one, right? we're just drawing experts into the nuclear negotiations now. I hope that's not the case. And I'm not saying that's the case, but yeah, I would hope that Mr. Witkoff and Mr. Kushner have nuclear experts, have sanctions experts, have all sorts of experts with whom they're regularly consulting and who are informing the U.S. position in terms of what we should ask Iran to do, and what we're telling Iran that we will do. Okay? The United States government, even now, after we've purged and doged our ranks and kicked out so much collective expertise, we still have vestigial, residual expertise on all these issues, right? That I would hope this administration would be using to help us move forward in negotiations. Unfortunately, I don't think they are, which is one of the reasons why I don't think we'll have a phase 2 agreement on the nuclear issue. But I hope I'm wrong.
Well, the Israelis have just said that the attack was a grave mistake. Effie Defrin, the chief of staff of the IDF, is assessing the strikes and approving plans for the future. The IDF will continue to operate throughout Lebanon. We are prepared for the possibility of additional firing. That strikes me, I mean, tell me what you think, Alan, but that strikes me as approving plans for the future. That is very nebulous, right? That doesn't have an imminency to it.
I could have written that statement. I could have written that statement, and I could have written the statement that the Chotem Olam command will now put out about how they will respond, masterfully and convincingly to any continued Israeli aggression. So much of this is just kabuki verbiage, that you have to put out, you have to check the box, and that's what both sides are doing now. Now, I'm not saying Israel's not going to do that, but again, with this, with this internet thing, as old man Allen says, people tend to overparse statements that are put out, right? Because you want to sort of figure out, what does this mean? What does it mean? A lot of it is just noise. Okay. People say it because they've got to fill, because media people are asking them, but you can't figure out here's the say, you cannot figure out what's going on based solely or even primarily on what government officials are telling you, period.
Well, on that point, a certain colleague of yours I mentioned before, so Ross, has just been, I'm just looking at some different news boards here, but he's just said, so would you agree that Israel and Iran are both using Lebanon as a bargaining chip, or in the bargaining process with the US? Israel is, quote, trying to spoil what they would consider a premature peace deal, while Iran wants to show Washington that it has, quote, a vote on how this conflict ends. I think that both parties, in a way, are aiming this conflict at Trump's decision-making process.
Well, I mean, to me, the key fact to note is that Iran isn't going to throw Hezbollah under the bus. They don't rely on Hezbollah as much as they did, because they've discovered a newer and better way of strategic deterrence, which is the Strait of Hormuz and bombing GCC energy infrastructure. But that doesn't mean they're going to discard Hezbollah, with whom they've had relations, since even before the Islamic Revolution in 1979. So, Hezbollah, ceasefire in Hezbollah was part of the original ceasefire, despite what President Trump and Israel said afterwards. And Iran is trying hard to make sure that Hezbollah and the ceasefire extends to Lebanon, which is something that Israel cannot countenance.
Well, what does this tell us about the one of the things we were debating with Alan yesterday was about the extent to unity within the IRGC, within the regime, because there's obviously different factions, but there's largely a united front because of the severity of the situation, the existentialism of it for their survival. But when we see these attacks right now, this set of strikes, why do you think they decided to move now? And what does this tell us about the mindset of those within Tehran?
Yeah, look, there's politics in Iran. I would argue more so than also in the United States. President Trump says, we might give Iran $1, and Lindsey Graham goes apoplectic. So there's politics in the United States too, despite the fact that President Trump has serious control over the Republican Party. But let's not be mistaken. The people we've put into power in Iran by killing the pre-existing leadership are more hardline more anti-American, less trusting of American Israel than the government we killed. And so they're seeing things, and I can't stress this enough, in an essentially different manner than we are. Okay? They don't trust President Trump. They don't trust Israel. They think, regardless of whatever accommodation can be reached with Israel or with the United States, this war will continue. The ceasefire might last months or years, but when the bombs stop, they will remain on a wartime footing. They will reconstitute their defense industrial base. They will rebuild their missiles and their drones. They could well actually begin to build or try to build a nuclear weapon. So we have put a bellicose, militaristic, distrustful leadership in Iran, and we're going to have to deal with them for the foreseeable future.
Well, it's just a police state, isn't it? It's a security state. That's what Iran has become. It's a
not necessarily, because that also, yeah, I mean, it's certainly not an ideological, pan-Islamic, we want to spread Islam state. It's become a nationalist, security state run by the military. But there's also one key point, and in this, it's similar to the United States. It's an oligarchy controlled by economic elites making good buck from being in control of the economic and political institutions that run the country. Okay, this is one of the reasons why the blockade against Iranian ports doesn't work that well, because the people who are running the country feel economic pain later and lesser than the Iranian people. The U.S. government has been operating on an assumption for decades that if you inflict pain on the Iranian people, they will put pressure on the Iranian leadership to change Iranian policy. That is largely a flawed model, because the Iranian people cannot put effective pressure on the Iranian leadership. Not only is it a flawed model, but by the sanctions regime, yes, we've given Iran far less money, but the money that still trickles into Iran goes into the pockets of the IRGC, who control the ports, who control the airplanes, who control the key industries, who can make money off of differential exchange rates. When Iran starts rebuilding, when this war is over, what companies will be rebuilding? IRGC companies. So this is where we are right now.
So, but then what does this tell us about okay, I'll put it this way. So we haven't spoken for a while, and actually there was another update statement that I hadn't seen. So I just want your reaction to this. Maybe I'm sure you reacted to it earlier where you were, but the IRG have said that this attack marks the beginning of, quote, a full week of continuous strikes. Is that just war of words? And as you said, it's more a noise, or is there some truth to that? And it could come at any time in different ways, levels of intensity, etc.
My informed answer is I don't know. But here's the one difference. The IRGC has always talked trash, right? I mean, this is just what they do. The difference now is that they mean it, and they're far more likely to execute what they say. Because, again, and we might have talked about this earlier, after the 12, they think strategically, the IRGC thinks we messed up. When President Trump killed Qasem Soleimani, we gave this performative, anemic response. We lobbed a couple of missiles after telling them we were going to lob missiles. And so the U.S. and Iran and the Iranian mindset became emboldened. I mean, the U.S. and Israel, they're like, well, look, Iran's not going to do anything, right? So we're going to be even more aggressive. So what Iran is trying to do, and what it's been trying to do since February 28th, is respond excessively. Not just target Israel, target GCC countries, So this works now because the big stick we had, you'd better stop Iran or we're going to attack you, we lost that stick, okay? We've attacked Iran. They didn't take the best we could give, because we could do even more damage, and we might well do it. We could level Iran if we wanted to, God forbid. So I'm not saying that Iran has taken the U.S.'s best shot, but without significant escalation, wiping out their desal centers, wiping out their ability to generate and transmit electricity, doing stuff like that. They've taken an attack by the most powerful military in world history and Israel, right? So what are they going to worry about, right? They're in a fight for their life, okay? They've taken serious attacks by the US. They need to reconstitute strategic deterrence. How do they do that? Strait of Hormuz, in the short term, Strait of Hormuz, and showing that they're willing to bomb Israel, which again doesn't get them that much, right, in terms of deterrence. But, attacking Kuwait, attacking Bahrain, maybe going after, the UAE again. So, they're fighting for their lives.
That makes me think of another point, Alan, if I may just, you leading in perfectly to something that I wanted to ask you. As I say, it's been quite a while since we spoke, I think, last time, and something that's really come to my mind, and maybe I'm overanalyzing it in your opinion, but I think that this has been one of the most useful events for providing the Iranians with strategic clarity, simply in the sense that for so long they always thought that the nuclear option was the nuclear bomb. Their biggest deterrence mechanism was a nuclear weapon. But actually, it's the Strait of Hormuz. It's really given them a clearer than ever sense that their biggest escalation point is just purely geography, and that the amount of pressure, for one specific reason, and then you're welcome to, which is simply, what is the US? It has the exorbitant privilege and duty of the global economy. And because of that exorbitant duty, it disproportionately affects the US economy. Over the long term, of course, it's not going to hurt it right now, but I think the Iranians think that they can exacerbate that even more than the Americans thought they could. You don't see it like that?
I do, but let's not downplay the cost. Yes, they can close the Strait of Hormuz, but again, it's closed for them also, or even with our blockade of Iranian ports, it's largely closed for them also. And let's not neglect the fact that whenever this war is over, the Iranian economy is in terms of annual inflation, in terms of unemployment, is at the worst levels it's been since, World War II, when we invaded them to establish a land bridge to the USSR, and there was widespread famine. So these people, Iranians, are facing, a dystopian economic hellscape whenever this war is over, which is one of the reasons why they're flailing frantically for some source of serious income, whether it's tolling, reparations, unblocked money, or easing of sanctions, because they're going to need money. So yeah, they have strategic leverage over us because they're able and willing to take a lot more economic pain and physical destruction than we are. But let's not make light of the fact that whenever this is over, or at least diminished in intensity, Iran is going to be dancing on the abyss of being a failed state.
Really? You think it's going to be that extreme, even though that they have so much power?
It depends, but yeah, it's going to be bleak, very bleak. And again, much like Iran squandered the goodwill of its people after the 12-day war last year, once this is over and Iran gets however much money it gets and is faced with the, guns or butter conundrum, they're going to go with guns. It's not like the IRGC, when this war is over, is going to say, oh, goodness, this war vitiated our economy. We have to start looking out after our own people and meeting their long expressed needs for, economic well-being. That's not going to happen. They will, as they've always done, route money toward the economic elites first and foremost, throw some subsidies, if they can, to everyone else, and focus on, rockets, missiles, stuff like that. So then, yeah, we have.
Well, how bad is the Iranian economy, do you think? Because there's obviously conflicting information. It's hard to believe.
It's horrible. AP News put out a story a couple of days ago. The annual inflation rate is I think for non-food items is 87%. For food items, it's higher. Millions have been laid off because of Israeli attacks on the petrochemical sector, on the steel sector, and on the fact that the Iranian internet, which is the source of many jobs, has been shut down, or had been shut down before it was partially reopened, you know, for 3 months or so. So it's hard to quantify, but there's a lot of data out there, and it shows in terms of inflation, in terms of supply chain disruptions, and in terms of unemployment. You know, the Iranian situation, I mean, Iran has always sort of eked by, right? They've been had sanctions on them since 1979, but it's orders of magnitude worse than it's been before.
But how much bad, how much worse can it get before it literally just implodes, right? We've been having this conversation on the channel for months and years about the Russians. You know,
I'll tell you this. I don't know, again, one of my favorites, declarative sentences, but
expert Alan Eyre, everyone.
But there will not be a point where the IRGC is in charge and says, enough. We will now accept the U.S. demands we have found previously unacceptable. You know, much like in 1988, Ayatollah Khomeini said, I will drink the poison chalice to preserve the revolution. That's not going to happen this time. It is far more likely that it is very unlikely, in my opinion, that the collective IRGC leadership at one point will say the economic pain that the West, that the US and Israel have inflicted on us is so much that we have to accept no indigenous enrichment. We have to accept having the Strait go back to the way it was before. We have to accept dismantling our nuclear infrastructure so that the Islamic Republic can survive. Because in their mind, that won't ensure the survival of the Islamic Republic. That will weaken it. Again, capitulation in the Iranian regime's mind at this point is a sign of weakness, is chum in the water that will just attract sharks from Israel and the United States, because they firmly believe both those countries are seeking to topple the Islamic Republic.
So I want to introduce everyone to Alia as well. Welcome, Alia, non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council, and who was very kind enough to jump on. Alia Alan Eyre, who is an ex-diplomat, distinguished fellow, I think it is, at the Middle East Institute, so just down the road from Atlantic Council in Washington. Alan was just taking us through some of his thoughts, Alia, about sort of the mindset of the IRGC, the propensity for them to respond, and generally keep it. How much would it take for the Iranian economy to actually sort of implode? Because we talk about this a lot, but what does that actually look like? You're welcome to just jump in with any immediate thoughts you have, or spar off some of Alan's thoughts. And, you know, Alan, you're welcome to jump in and out. And, you know, if you're like, I need to have a break, then, you know, you jump on as you wish on your way. But yeah, Alia, I'll hand it to you if you had any initial thoughts about what's been going on.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what you've covered, but one thing that I'll say to that point is that, you know, President Trump, it seems, you know, from the flashes that are coming up on my screen, is sort of being quite British about all of this. So he's sort of saying, keep calm and carry on, you know, there's nothing to see here. And both he and Hegseth have sort of, they've been saying we're close to a deal. They've been saying that all day. So this is just underlining, I think, how much they want it, and that they're seeking to kind of play defense in a way, which I think is such an extraordinary kind of meta moment when you think that they, you know, basically started all of this, you know, to be honest. And now, as predicted, as we all predicted, Alan as well, I'm sure, you know, they want out. But one, this isn't a game. And I think no matter how many Department of War videos represented as such, obviously it's not. And two, you know, this is the Middle East. This is the IRGC, no less. You know, they are champions at the long game. And actually, you know, I grew up in Bahrain, and my mother, when she rang some family friends to check in on them a few weeks ago, you know, typical of Gulfies, they responded with a joke. And they said, yeah, Trump expects the Iranis to surrender in 2 days when it takes them 12 years to stitch a carpet. And I think that geopolitically as well, you know, the regime in Tehran, they savor the long game. And if you just think of how they avenged the assassination of their commander, Qasem Soleimani, in Iraq, that was like a slow-burning, long, local campaign that culminated in the call for the ejection of US troops from Iraq. They also, they've sponsored Hezbollah. They've weaved Hezbollah into the fabric of Lebanon through a vast social network, welfare network, and the gradual co-optation of Christian political elites over decades. So I think what they've been signaling is, we decide when this ends. And I think this is part of that. I think, the power balance, it just is ever in their favor.
Well, that's actually quite interesting, Alan. You're welcome to respond if you want. But there was a question.
Let me say one thing. I've just looked at Alia's resume, which is so impressive. I'm not going to disagree with anything she says. I'm not picking a fight with her. Whatever she says.
Okay.
I like this. I should come here more often.
I should have presented this as a debate. Alan's some like hardcore I should change this, debate and explosive moment, right? No, but there was a question actually to you, Alan, which kind of touches on what you literally just said, Alia, which is sort of like, someone was curious what you think about the Gulf states' view on this. Because if Trump is trying so hard to keep BB from responding, what does that tell the Gulf states? How will they feel about Trump's effective, as they call it, timidity towards allowing a response to the IRGC?
I don't think you can make any generalization about the Gulf states. It's like, making a generalization about Africa, or about what Iranians think. What do Iranians think about the war? You'd have to take it state by state. I think there's a full spectrum. Some states are obviously more aligned with the U.S. and Israel than others. Every state is pursuing its own national interests. So I can't make a definitive, veridical statement about. Yeah. I mean, I think they all want the war to stop, and they're all terrified about, a bellicose, truculent, and rearmed Iran once the war stops.
Yeah.
Okay. You agree, Alia?
Yeah, no, I do. I think I agree on the initial sentiment, which is.
Have you looked up Alan's resume? You're not going to question Alan now, are you?
No, because I already know it.
More like a tweet than a resume, for God's sake.
No, he's notorious.
No, but I think it's a fair point, especially given the divergence of the Emiratis to the Saudis now. I mean, what we're seeing happen with the broader Gulf states, it's not monolithic, never that it has been, but we're specifically seeing it even more disrupted in its unity than before. So yeah, it's interesting. Go on, Ali. Sorry.
Because this is sort of like region changing. It's changing the Gulf itself as we speak. I think what you're getting at is that they see this need to diversify their defense relationships. Probably they were feeling it already before all of this. I think, as I mentioned once before, the Houthi attack in 2022 of the Emiratis, also the Houthi drone attack on some Aramco infrastructure in 2019, I believe it was. They just felt like there's been this limp response. Then when the Israelis bombed Doha in Qatar in September, there was this sort of sense of, oh my gosh. And then little did they know that the finale was yet to come in these, fireworks that we've seen that have, totally undermined their basic proposition. And they've been taken as strategic hostages in all of this. And that lack of agency, which they had essentially kind of passed on to the US in a way through that defense architecture, has left them completely exposed. Right. So I think that they will try and going forward produce a situation where they can never find themselves with this sort of limited power. And that's despite all of their vast wealth and their, all the investments they've made. They have very limited agency in all of this. They are pressuring President Trump as much as they can. But there's like a complicated chain here where, they're leaning on him, which is the Iranis, strategy, by the way. It's to get them to feel some pain, to lean on Trump. He then leans on Netanyahu, and then, Netanyahu, it's yet to be seen. Apparently, the pressure from Trump worked earlier this week. But I think that this is I don't know if Alan agrees, this might be the gravest threat to the ceasefire we've had so far.
It's the first time that they've struck since April. Sorry, not to cut you off. It's the first, just to double check here. Yes, it's the first set of strikes since April. The IRGC said that this is the beginning of a full week of continuous strikes, end quote. Israel said it was a grave mistake for Iran to have done. But the latest bit of breaking news in the past few minutes is that Israel has now closed the Gaza crossings after the missile attack. So the Israeli government agency Kogat has said it's closing all crossings into Gaza following the attack. Following the missile attack, necessary security measures have been implemented, including, the closure of the crossings into the Gaza Strip, amongst them Kerem Shalom crossing and Rafah crossing. I don't know. Any immediate reaction to that? Does that mean anything? Is that their level of escalation in response? And we're not going to see missile strikes. That's the way that the Israelis can sort of get one back, if that makes sense.
I don't know what Alan thinks, but my instinct is that the Israelis will use any excuse to tighten the siege of Gaza. So, and unfortunately, Hamas have no matter the narrative, Hamas have no big benefactor out there the Palestinians don't have any big benefactor that's looking to link anything or look after their interests. Unfortunately, they're orphaned geopolitically. So, yeah, I think this is just Bibi seizing the moment to kind of, make a few more inroads cheaply in Gaza, is my sense.
Well, yeah, that makes sense to me. I mean, again, Israel has never met a ceasefire it didn't want to violate. Yeah. It's killed 1,000 Palestinians since the ceasefire in October of last year, as opposed to, I think, 4 Israeli soldiers being killed. So, yeah, I mean, they don't need an excuse to continue to immiserate the Palestinian people in Gaza, right? That's their default setting. And that's what they want the default setting to be, with Iran and with Hezbollah. They want that to be like water running downhill. This constant low level, kill of this guy, bomb that suburb, you take out this building because some guy was living there. This is, what they want to be the new normal,
But I find it curious, actually, the more that this goes on, right? So we've been talking for about 45 minutes. So I shouldn't tell Ellen that, he'll leave. But we've been talking for a bit, and the urgency of this just isn't there, right? I'm looking at a few news, live update stream things. I'm not other people with sort of millions of people around me to give me updates every imminent moment. But from what I'm not seeing continuous amounts of information here. It doesn't seem like the longer this goes on that we're going to see some kind of response. But do you think that we could see the Israelis do something another night? Another night they decide to launch their own set of attacks because they decide to sort of lure the IRGC into some sort of false sense of security. Not that they'd ever be that naive, I think, the IRGC. No?
I mean, again, my two Israel will now try to figure out the maximum it can do without irritating President Trump, and do that. Consistent with the goal of trying to restart large-scale military attacks on Iran and Hezbollah.
Yeah, there was another thing that happened today. I mean, firstly, the strikes on Dahia. I've been to Dahia. I don't know if you have, Alan, and it's like bombing, Islington in London, or like.
Don't say that. I live near it.
Well, there you go. This is a highly built-up urban area, which in and of itself, violates all kinds of international laws, let alone the politics and the fragility of the ceasefire. So the notion that they're bombing in Beirut, as though it was a normal policy, high rises that contain families and stuff. Again, that's a military doctrine, I think, which has just been so normalized, but we should question it, on its own terms anyway. But isn't there another thing that seemed to happen today, and it's probably been overtaken by the hot stuff, which is that President Trump said in an interview with NBC today that there will be no unfreezing of Iranian assets. But we know that this is a condition for Iran. They've made that very clear over and over again. And it also has to be handled very delicately by the Trump administration, because this is exactly what they criticized, the Obama deal for. So we had this kind of escalation on the Lebanese front, and this kind of this strange foxtrot that's been on repeat in the Gulf, where the Iranians are saying, show me the money to open the strait. And Trump probably really, really wants to, but he feels like, optically and politically, he can't. I don't know what you think about it.
That's exactly right. I mean, the broad parameters of a phase 1 deal are obvious, which is, Iran says the strait is open, though it's not. It's under Iranian management. and the lifting of the naval blockade. The problem is that, well, there's lots of problems. One of them is that Iran, as you said, wants money and isn't going to wait for a phase 2 agreement for money because they know the phase 2 agreement will never happen.
Yeah.
And President Trump needs some sort of statement in the MOU that allows him to say, better deal nuclear than Obama. And Iran has said they don't want to make any nuclear concessions in phase 1. They want to keep it strictly, Hormuz for lifting the blockade. Whereas, again, President Trump wants some sort of at least ambiguous, amorphous resolution of the HEU issue, which Iran is not going to do because that's one of the chips it has. So, yeah, I mean, that's the dynamic. And again, and so while that's happening, this stasis, you've got this unstable ceasefire that wants to be broken by Israel. So yeah, it's an incredibly unstable, dynamic situation. And
So
yeah, the ticking time bomb here is the Strait of Hormuz, because the U.S. has been insulated. We've been drawing down our strategic petroleum reserve. There's been some demand destruction, but not a lot. The contagion has happened in Asia, Africa, Europe, but it hasn't hit U.S. shores other than the price of gasoline going up, right?
Mm-hmm.
But financial markets have been surprisingly obtuse in terms of reading the writing on the wall. That's going to change in a couple of weeks, right?
So
the pain, capital P, starts hitting the U.S. economy.
So there's a couple of things here. So the US, well, Trump and Bibi just got off the phone call about 5-6 minutes ago.
Mm-hmm.
And the latest is that Netanyahu is now apparently holding talks with senior military leaders. Flights have also been suspended at Tehran airport. It's closed all its airspace in the western part of the country, so the first half, the western half. As I don't know, what is, to you guys with your regional expertise, what does that mean? Does that mean imminent response from Israel, or are they going to think about it? They're going to think of options for the next few days, or he's just like, screw it. I spoke to Trump. I've told him why we must do this. And Trump's like, okay, fine. One set of strikes and then go back to ceasefire. I don't think he'd take that risk, would he?
Well, I'll just say that I think airspaces have been closing across the region all evening, kind of like preemptively. I think every country has been closing them. Just what Alan said before, I think what's so extraordinary is how, and I'll let Alan answer the immediate question, but the nuclear material, the enriched uranium, how far off the agenda it currently is, and how we've got a couple of intermediate steps, right? So we have the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, which presents this kind of emergency that's impacting the global economy, and there is this kind of block, for everything. But then now we have the situation heating up in Lebanon. So it's like Lebanon, intermediate Hormuz, and then, highly enriched uranium all the way down. Whereas when you think about the rationale, to the extent we were provided with the rationale for this, nuclear weapons were front and center. And I think it's just, emblematic of the fact that, as we warned, as happened in the Iraq War, the second order effects that you can't necessarily predict, although many people foresaw, tend to flood the zone and take over. And this is exactly what's happening. So that, as each week goes on, new dynamics are introduced. And then the protagonists, certainly on the American side, have less and less control. And of course, the Iranis will always have that greater degree of control by virtue of being in the region, of being masterful, of ostensibly defending themselves and their interests at home. So they're always going to have that advantage. But I'll let Alan answer the question about the implications of closed airspace and whether...
You're exactly right, Alia. And this will have to be my last comment because I do have to run now. My apologies. I'm just too intimidated, so I'm going to leave and let
that narrative, Alan.
Here's how I see it. When we did the JCPOA in 2015, we had one issue. We had the nuclear issue at a relatively rudimentary stage of the Iranian, not a relatively rudimentary stage. They had an industrial nuclear program. It was resilient. It was spread out. It was redundant. The U.S. waited far too long to deal with the Iranian nuclear problem, much like we did with North Korea, because that's what we do. We wait until it's an above-the-fold story in the newspaper, And then we're like, okay, shoot, we got to deal with it. But still, it was relatively easy. Iran's nuclear program now is far more advanced. You know, they've got 60% HEU. They have, you know, they don't trust us. They've got a new militarized leadership that's far less user-friendly. So that makes it harder. You've got the Strait of Hormuz, right? You've had the fact that they've been attacked twice militarily in the last year, and you've got Lebanon. So the issues on the plate right now are orders of magnitude more complex than President Obama had. And this U.S. administration, and it pains me to say this, and I don't say it as any sort of partisan, because I've worked for every president to include, you know, Reagan. This administration is manifestly incompetent when it comes to diplomacy. They don't like doing it. They're not good at it. They don't have the strategic patience. That might change. We all saw that, you know, Kushner and Witkoff went down to Tennessee to meet with actual nuclear experts.
Yeah.
Great. So maybe I'm wrong. I hope I'm wrong. And I hope the U.S. government is using the substantial, vestigial, collective expertise it has to try to figure out how to solve not just one Rubik's Cube, but all these Rubik's Cubes at the same time. Unfortunately, I think it unlikely. I think the U.S. administration, in addition to not using expertise, tends to self-sabotage because it has no strategic messaging discipline. And President Trump says stuff that makes it harder. Or, you know, the Secretary of the Treasury saying, not only are we not going to give Iran money, we're going to use Iran's money to rebuild the GCC infrastructure that Iran destroyed.
Yeah.
Is that a new policy position, or is that just Secretary Bessent talking trash? I don't.
So, Alan, before you go, can I grab your quick take on one quick? I'm sure you're familiar with the journalist Gideon Levy, but he basically said that the region faces just two scenarios from here: either a return to a ceasefire or a return to all-out conflict. Which do you think it's going to go?
Well, a ceasefire is not stable, so that's not an option. You can't return to a ceasefire because a ceasefire is a transition from one state to another, right? So that's not an option. So the options are sort of low-level ongoing hostilities or a comprehensive peace that, I said this the other day, you know, diplomacy rarely solves problems. At best, it manages messes. The mess being sort of a complex system. We have broken the complex system that was extant in the Middle East. So now, if we're lucky, we can manage the mess that results from breaking that sort of complex homeostasis. I don't think we can do that. So I think, at least for the short term, we will be dealing with a situation where there's ongoing, I hope, only low-level hostilities. And in terms of greater global significance, you're not getting the Strait of Hormuz back to 100 to 130 ships a day, at least for the rest of the year. And the economic consequences of that, we'll see.
Well, Alan, Eyre of the Middle East Institute, distinguished fellow, but also someone with only a pamphlet of a credentials versus Alia's book or something, or whatever you said.
Like all these degrees, I barely graduated college, for God's sakes.
You shouldn't have told me that. I tried to bring on the most, credentialized and Alan, it was a pleasure.
They have a good saying in Persian. And then I'll go. They say, "Ab ke hast tayammum botele," which is when you're doing ritual ablutions, before you pray, and if you don't have water, there's a thing called tayammum, which is where you clean your hands with sand, right? But the Persian saying is, if you have water, you don't need sand.
Like I said, I need to come here more often.
Anyway, all the best to you both.
Thanks
a lot, Alan. Have a good evening. Okay. That was Alan Eyre, everyone, a regular on the show. And actually, as you can tell, I think one of only 3 or less even. I think he was the only one at the time who could speak Farsi during the JCPOA negotiations. So he is a real expert on these things, not just from a Western point of view. He really put himself in the minds, as best he could at the time, the Islamic Republic or the IGC. So, but Alia, thank you for staying on a little bit longer. we covered with Alan a little bit of an immediate reaction to the situation. I'll put the same question I sort of posited to Alan just then. Like, do you agree that it's not really a ceasefire because they keep violating it? But like, I guess, are we going to return to a hope of restrained engagement versus all-out conflict? What do you think is the likelihood from this?
Well, I think what happens tonight will determine that. Like, I think we are at this inflection point where, Trump is, didn't he tweet out, like, to the Iranians, you shot your shot, now enough? And I think he said the same to Bibi. So it's like whether, the Iranians will wait to see what Israel does. Trump doesn't determine their moves. But if Israel doesn't hit back, then they would have a reason maybe to retreat a little, or certainly not to escalate, even though they enjoy the escalation dominance. So it does now all come down to Bibi, to Netanyahu, and what he does tonight. Because, I think everything is at stake, actually. And if he chooses to retaliate to the retaliation, he will be escalating. And then I think things could get out of control very quickly, no matter how much, as I said before, Trump and Hegseth seem to want a ceasefire. But this is the Middle East, wishing isn't a strategy.
I think it's a good point about Hegseth as well, though, Alia, as well. I mean, after his comments about Europe on D-Day, 2 days ago, or yesterday, or whenever it was. I think it's really interesting. And I think it's this level of depth of analysis, which is why it was interesting to have the both of you back and forth, because you have a certain degree of professional experience, regional experience, empirical experience on the ground that I don't. A lot of people watching might not. So and with that in mind, I mean, people, if they're interested in that sort of stuff, you like these kinds of in-depth conversations, then you should definitely subscribe, because we'll be sure to have Alan and Alia back for this sort of, hoping in a more positive light. But if you like that sort of thing, then like the video and subscribe. But anyway, my small CTA aside, Alia, I'm just seeing here, actually, there's a couple more bits of news. So Trump said to Axios in the past few minutes, he said that I don't want a final deal with Iran to blow up, great choice of words as always, because of what is happening. I'm going to call Bibi right now and tell him not to retaliate. Each of them had their fun. Israel had its strike and Iran had its strike. We don't need another one. Trump says that if Israel strikes back, the conflict will just continue for 47 years or the last 3,000.
Okay. I mean, this is not a religious conflict. This is a highly modern political. Okay. No, I think that's just underscoring how much he wants it, but it's also telling us, which he probably shouldn't have, telling us that this is probably a moment of truth where we'll see which is the tail and which is the dog. So we're going to see.
No, I said that. I said that at the very beginning, actually. Although not with such a unique analogy, I have to say that's a new one on me. But which is simply this is a test case, isn't it? Who really commands who, or really adheres to the demands of the other? If Netanyahu defies Trump's very explicit demands, we know just how little sway Trump has, or the US, maybe more broadly at least, has over the Israelis. But if they don't, then that demonstrates quite clearly that the US does have some degree of influence.
It should do. It literally holds all the cards in that relationship, right? So, on paper, it's got a huge amount of influence. But as you say, is it slipping away? It's not just, by the way, the material, the kind of, approaching existential support from the US to Israel in terms of its economy, but also its military. It's not just that. It's the fact that Trump is very popular within Israel. And Netanyahu, with elections coming up, doesn't necessarily want to put daylight between him and Trump. So, there are many factors on paper that would militate towards Netanyahu listening to that phone call and taking heed. But we know that Netanyahu right now, and the IDF to some extent, have an escalatory logic of their own. And they're sensing opportunities, hence the tightening of the siege in Gaza. And they do not want a ceasefire between the US and Iran. They want the US to, quote unquote, finish the job. So this might be an opportunity for them, if they feel that the relationship is beyond repair, that they're willing to throw it away in a sense, certainly Netanyahu, that they might sort of go rogue no pun intended, and maybe take his advice with a pinch of salt. So I think that there is this impulse there that we probably haven't seen enough gumption before for it to exist, but it certainly does in this current setup within Israel. So to the extent that it's a question of whether he will or will not take heed, because as I said, he should.
No, so the Israelis the IDF, just to your point, have said in the past few minutes as well, they will strike the enemy as soon as the order is given. So that was the military chief or general staff conducting a situational assessment. Lieutenant General Eyal Zamir vows the country will strike the enemy with determination. So it's all dependent on the political now. The military arm is ready to go. They're chomping at the bit. They've probably closed these areas of Gaza or entrance because that's what they can do, maybe without needing political sort of green light. I don't know if that would be the case.
No one gives a shit about Gaza, unfortunately. Yeah, it's barely even tied to any of this, unfortunately. As we say, it's just an opportunity for them to, kick them and take more ground. But go on.
No, that was largely just. I'm just wondering if there is any political restraint that exists over Gaza, but clearly not. And frankly, given the people that are in that government, I don't know why I even asked that question.
Well, people turned away. Trump turned away a long time ago. So yeah, I think that they've been left to their fate currently, certainly. But I think Lebanon, the Lebanon dynamic is a really determinative one, because not just of Hezbollah's power and the fact it's a neighboring state for Israel, but because what's happening in Lebanon is really significant for Lebanon as a country and as a society. The Lebanese president, Joseph Aoun, gave an interview. I don't know if you saw it on Amanpour the other day. I think it was on Friday. And the headline that kind of emerged from that and that dominated was that he was asked about the Irani statement that decried the peace talks between Israel and the Lebanese government. And Aoun said, quite rightly, it's not your country, basically, shut your mouth, it's not your country. But actually, for most of the interview with Amanpour, he was talking about how counterproductive and destructive Israeli policy in Lebanon is. He said Israel can invade the whole country. He said they can flatten the whole country, but they will never achieve their objectives. It's short-sighted. Dealing with non-state actors is different than dealing with conventional forces. And he said Hezbollah is an idea. It's not a geographic objective. It's war amongst the people, as Rupert Smith said. He quoted the theorist Rupert Smith. So he said, how is Israel measuring success? In body counts? They tried that in Gaza. Hamas is still going. So, he said, you need social and political, everything that we've been saying, repeatedly on this. You need social, political, and economic measures. That's 90% of it. And Hezbollah can only be dealt with domestically. They don't need Israel to keep doing this and to keep reinforcing the reasons for its existence and the reasons that it gives that it needs to keep its arms. So, he was basically saying what I was saying in the last live, that there's absolutely no military solution to the Hezbollah problem. And Israel's violence against Lebanon's sovereignty certainly doesn't move the needle forward for anyone. It just weakens the Lebanese armed forces. It reinforces Hezbollah's reason for existing. And by the way, the IDF has bombed the Laf in southern Lebanon as well. So the whole thing is really, it's a circus. And I think that Lebanon in and of itself, the escalation there could kind of like have, shrapnel, geopolitical shrapnel for the whole region, just within Lebanon if this keeps going. But again, the Israelis don't seem to care because they want these states to be inherently weak and destruction serves their current geopolitical agenda.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's a challenging one because we're educated in the West or in the media or in certain ways to be very careful. Sorry, my chair is getting stuck on my desk here. To be very careful of the way that we frame things, or not to be overly critical of Israel for the idea of anti-Semitism and so on. But anyone of a reasonable mind can recognize that there is a common denominator in a lot of this, a disruptor, and that is specifically the Israeli government. And what they are doing in Lebanon is heinous. I refrain from using certain strong words occasionally, but I'm tired of kind of doing that. And when it comes to Lebanon, right, we've got a state which was essentially failing. Now it's largely failed, but we're also on the border of it being just a complete collapse state, sort of like Somalia in the 1990s, or Haiti is now, right? Just a completely dysfunctional entity that has no governance at all. The government does exist, but they don't have any ability to influence Hezbollah, unfortunately, and they're just at the sort of at the beck and call of whatever the Israeli government wants to do. So sort of, the Israelis seem hell bent on on the sort of forced acquisition of additional territory, all under the pre-concept of preemptive protection and all this sort of stuff. But what was the Golan Heights for? To protect them against Assad and the situation there. Well, apparently now the Golan Heights isn't enough, so they've built a buffer zone over the buffer zone. But there's another buffer zone they need now. So hang on, how much of this territorial, squatting is going to stop before they're just like, we'll just people live there now. Actually, it's Israeli as well. We might as well just keep expanding the territory,
I like your expression there, your facial expression, which is basically, being suspicious that you're being gaslit. Like you just encapsulated that. And that's basically what their policy is, to just basically gaslight everyone, that there's a ceasefire, that they need big chunks of territory of other people's lands, that every Palestinian is basically a terrorist or related to a terror. All of these new normals they're trying to set for us. And I think most of the world is like, I'm not sure.
And it's this thing sort of, I'm sure some people watching are maybe logged off because they're like, oh, he's anti-Semitic, then he doesn't think Israel has a right to exist. And it's like, that's a very lazy and deliberately simplistic interpretation of a very complex argument or matter.
But I think that most of your demographic, well, I don't know, but particularly if you've got, Gen Z and Gen Alpha, I think that they just accept at face value that the anti-Semitic thing is a ruse and is non-applicable. And, everyone's talking about the actions of a nation state, and no one is even, that scarcely enters into the complaint against what's happening and opposing atrocities. So, I just based on opinion surveys and stuff, I think that we're in a fairly safe space here because people are so young. And I think that Israel has lost that battle, the narrative battle that you really had in a chokehold for so many years. I think the next generation just tell it like it is. And the notion that they'll be silenced because of some old-fashioned and outdated and kind of like intellectually offensive notion that you're anti-Semitic because you're criticizing the activities of an army and the policy of a nation state. Anyway, I just think that
but it's also Alia, how far things have come in the past. In the 2.5 years of this entire largely since October 7th, when this new reality of the Middle East largely emerged, right? Each thing is arguably a reciprocation of events preceding that. Which was the original inflection being October 7th, but which obviously was brewing for years. But bottom line is, when that first started, I obviously felt a lot more empathy and consideration to the Israeli perspective. But the longer that this goes on, and again, you have to distinguish between government and country or state as well. It's continual, like the disturbances. Like the Iranians say that they're responding to what the Israelis were doing in Lebanon earlier, and despite them seeking a ceasefire, a peace deal, whatever, in Washington last week with the Lebanese, they still continue to bomb. They still continue to strike. So it's sort of like, okay, so they're not helping themselves. So sort of, are you genuinely seeking peace, or it's just sort of you're trying to, and ultimately, I'll land with this point simply, is that you can see that the overarching perspective to the situation in the world has so fundamentally changed. When October 7th happened, there was a real, Israel has a right to defend itself, and we need to do more to prevent the terroristic acts and or whatever of Hezbollah or other proxies. But the overwhelming majority of the international community is now like, okay, Israel, seriously, like Netanyahu and everyone, like people, even people who are like, okay, the IRGC is the worst thing, or the Islamic Republic is a disgusting regime in the way that it treats its Iranian people. But it's like, well, guys, like they kind of respond like Israel, you're kind of provoking them, sort of like even the most moderate people that I've spoken to, even the ones that are like heinously against the IRGC are like, well, Israel's not doing great. They're not helping the situation either, sort of thing. Sorry, that was I garbled my description there a little bit, but I think you know what I'm saying.
It's great. Like, no, I think that, yeah, you're just representing, as I say, how the needle has moved, how there's no going back. The world has seen, we can't unsee what we've seen. And it's something that, you know, in the Middle East, we've been saying for many years is you know, the dehumanization is so pervasive. Not just the injustice of the occupation, but now we have all of these injustices and atrocities and calamities within it. I mean, they come so thick and fast that you forget them. And that's part of the strategy. So do you remember when they enforced starvation on children in Gaza? I mean, it just doesn't, you know, the IDF is shooting kids in the head on a daily basis, but they literally, this was a man-made famine that was killing children. I remember a Palestinian journalist was live streaming, a Facebook friend of mine, through the camps in Gaza. I mean, it was haunting. You could just hear children crying out in their tents of hunger. And that was that was a political decision. It was used as, you know, in the cold light of day, the decision was made to do that to Gaza over a period of many, many weeks. And so many children suffered. That is just the least of, you know, that's just one policy area, a thread that we can pull out. And there have been so many. And as I say, we've all seen it on our phones. People can't unsee that. But I think, you know, one of our audience members put in the chat that Israel is just mowing the lawn in Lebanon. But, you know, Israel it literally set the freaking garden on fire with the pager attack, right? Where it killed all of Hezbollah's commanders. It got some kerosene and just dumped it all out. Set the whole bloody garden on fire. Makes not a jot of difference. Because by definition, these groups rejuvenate themselves because their raison d'etre and their cause is still there. And I think that enough is an indictment on the notion that there is a military solution to this problem. So, you know, the fact that we keep watching this movie, as I said last time, of Israel trying to deal with this problem militarily and hurting so many people in the process, only to be back in a weaker position than they were in before, is, you know, it just defies belief, and it's so irresponsible, and it's serving an agenda that probably has very little to do with actually trying to get a handle on Hezbollah and trying to disarm it.
No, and you know, as I say, I'm checking various. Wow, the British Foreign Secretary has said that both sides must show restraint and de-escalate. Okay, Yvette. Everyone's going to be listening to what the British have to say on this matter. I don't like saying that, but Europe and Britain have been largely completely irrelevant in all this, haven't they? Which is a shame. But Alia, I mean, I've got another stream actually just after this. So I guess the last thing I'd ask you, simply before maybe we wrap everyone, we're going to be joined by Larry Johnson on this next one, but I'm going to start a new stream just because I think Alia probably needs a break and deserves it. She actually was going to go to sleep, and then I managed to persuade her to come out of bed to join us for this sort of late night stream. So Alia, I really appreciate it. I wanted to give you, you know, final thoughts on what we've seen tonight, and maybe, you know, hopefully we can maybe reconvene on Wednesday. We seem to stream on Wednesdays. Maybe we should make that a weekly thing, if you're interested.
Oh, do we? Okay, yeah. Has that been the pattern? I see someone saying this Alia is such a bullshitter. So maybe I should have stayed in bed.
Oh, I'll kick them out.
No, it's okay. But yeah, maybe I should have stayed in bed. No, I'm just, yeah, I think that I would just point to, you know, it's a breaking story. There isn't a huge amount to add, apart from the fact that what Netanyahu decides to do tonight, I think, will be hugely determining, not just in terms of what happens in Lebanon, but in terms of the fate of the ceasefire with Iran. And that the whole region will be on tenterhooks tonight because the Gulf states cannot, you know, they're at their wits' end. They can't take another barrage. They can't take any more of this. And they will be leaning on Trump, who will be leaning on Netanyahu. So the question is tonight whether that modus operandi for restraint is actually will work, or will it be a busted flush?